Hey there. Tonight, we're exploring one of humanity's most underappreciated achievements, the Postal Service. But forget everything you think you know about romantic mail carriers, galloping heroically across scenic landscapes, delivering love letters and important documents. We're about to discover the reality of ancient postal work, where delivering a message meant riding horses to death, surviving constant bandit attacks, and facing execution if your delivery was late. All while earning exactly zero money, because postal service was forced government labor. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or subscribe. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. You've just woken up on the Persian Royal Road, one of the ancient world's first organized postal routes. And the first thing you notice isn't the historical significance of participating in early communication infrastructure. It's that you're being handed a sealed clay tablet with urgent government correspondence. Given a half-dead horse that looks like it's already contemplating suicide. And informed that you have exactly 1 day to deliver this message to a destination that's 1,500 miles away. Or you'll be executed for treason against the Persian Empire. The postal supervisor, a hard-faced official whose job apparently consists of sending couriers to their deaths and not caring when they don't return, explains your assignment with all the warmth of someone ordering executions. The message must reach the satrap by tomorrow sunset, he announces, while gesturing vaguely eastward toward terrain that includes mountains, deserts, rivers, and approximately 1,000 opportunities to die horribly. Failure means death for you and your family. Lost messages mean death. Damaged seals mean death. The Empire's communication cannot be delayed by your weakness or incompetence. The physical impossibility of the delivery requirements reveals itself immediately when you do basic mathematics. 1,500 miles in 24 hours requires maintaining an average speed of over 60 miles per hour continuously without rest, which would be challenging in a modern car on a highway and is completely impossible on a half-starved horse traveling on ancient roads that are barely distinguishable from random dirt paths. You're being asked to accomplish something that defies the laws of physics while being threatened with death for failing at the impossible. The relay system that's supposed to make these deliveries possible consists of stations where fresh horses and riders are theoretically available to continue the journey. But the reality is that stations are irregularly spaced, frequently abandoned, and often occupied by bandits who've killed the previous station keepers and taken over the facilities for robbery purposes. The theoretical relay system works beautifully in royal planning documents and catastrophically in actual practice. Your first horse, which you've been assured is one of the finest animals available, immediately demonstrates why ancient postal work had mortality rates that rivaled combat service. The horse is exhausted, malnourished, and appears to have been ridden nearly to death by the previous courier. It limps, wheezes, and shows clear signs of having been beaten repeatedly by riders who prioritize speed over animal welfare. Which means all riders, because anything less than maximum speed results in execution. The saddle situation reveals another aspect of postal work that doesn't appear in romantic depictions. The saddle is a primitive leather contraption that provides minimal cushioning and no real security, meaning that extended riding at high speeds causes injuries that start as discomfort and progress through pain to open wounds that make sitting on a horse feel like sitting on a cheese grater made of broken glass and fire. The saddle sores that develop over days of continuous riding can become infected and cause death from sepsis, even if you survive everything else. The route you're supposed to follow isn't marked, isn't maintained, and frequently doesn't actually exist as a coherent path. The Royal Road sounds impressive until you realize it's mostly a general direction across terrain where you're expected to figure out the specific route while maintaining impossible speeds and avoiding the numerous hazards that kill postal couriers with depressing regularity. The first day of riding reveals why ancient postal couriers had life expectancies measured in weeks rather than years. You're maintaining speeds that exhaust both horse and rider while navigating terrain that ranges from difficult to impassable. The horse is stumbling from exhaustion. You're developing saddle sores that make every movement excruciating. And you haven't eaten anything substantial because stopping to eat means falling behind schedule, which means execution. The weather conditions that you're expected to ignore include a sandstorm that reduces visibility to approximately zero while filling your mouth, eyes, and lungs with abrasive particles that make breathing feel like inhaling ground glass. The Postal Service doesn't acknowledge weather as a valid excuse for delays because the empire's business cannot wait for something as trivial as natural disasters that would stop any reasonable person from attempting travel. The first relay station you reach demonstrates why the theoretical postal system rarely functioned as designed. The station is abandoned. The horses are gone, and the facilities are burned ruins that suggest violent conflict occurred here recently. You're expected to continue your journey without fresh horses or supplies because the postal system assumes that stations are functional even when they're clearly not. The bandit encounter that follows reveals another occupational hazard that postal couriers face constantly. A group of armed men emerges from cover along the road and demands that you stop and surrender whatever you're carrying. The bandits aren't interested in your explanations about government messages and execution threats. They're interested in robbery. And postal couriers are attractive targets because they're traveling alone with potentially valuable items. Your escape from the bandits involves running your already exhausted horse at speeds that would be cruel to a fresh animal and are actively life-threatening to one that's been ridden hard for hours. The horse collapses after a mile of panicked flight, dying from the combination of previous exhaustion and final desperate exertion. You're now on foot, miles from anywhere, carrying a message that must be delivered on an impossible schedule or you'll be executed. The forced march that follows demonstrates the physical demands of postal work that extend beyond riding skills. You're walking as fast as possible while carrying equipment, supplies, and the message that's more important than your life, according to Persian imperial priorities. The march causes blisters, muscle strains, and exhaustion that accumulates until walking becomes an exercise in willpower rather than physical capability. The second relay station provides temporary relief when you discover it's actually functional with horses and a replacement courier available. The handoff process involves transferring the message, explaining the route conditions, and warning the next courier about the dead station and active bandits. Though this information doesn't change anything because the next courier has the same impossible assignment and same death threats that motivate maximum effort regardless of obstacles. The replacement courier who takes over your leg of the journey is a young man who looks like he's been doing postal work for a few weeks and appears to have aged 10 years from the experience. He takes the message with resignation rather than enthusiasm, checks his horse with the expertise of someone who knows he's probably riding it to death, and sets off at a gallop that will either get the message to the next station or kill him in the attempt. Your return journey to your starting point reveals that postal couriers are expected to complete round trips without rest, payment, or acknowledgement of the dangers they've survived. The return trip lacks the time pressure of the original delivery, but includes all the same hazards of bandit attacks, animal failures, and terrain difficulties that make ancient travel consistently dangerous regardless of urgency. The physical damage from your first postal assignment includes saddle sores that have progressed to open wounds, dehydration from inadequate water access, muscle strains from days of continuous exertion, and the beginning of chronic health problems that will worsen with continued postal work. Your body is already showing signs of the deterioration that kills or permanently disables postal couriers who survive long enough to accumulate injuries. The payment for your work consists of a meal, a place to sleep, and the privilege of being assigned another impossible delivery tomorrow. There's no monetary compensation because postal service is considered government obligation rather than employment, making it a form of forced labor that's justified through appeals to imperial necessity and threats of execution for refusal. The social status of postal couriers reveals itself through interactions with other people who view mail carriers as disposable servants rather than skilled workers performing dangerous service. Couriers receive no respect, no gratitude, and no recognition beyond criticism when deliveries are late and blame when messages are lost, regardless of circumstances that made successful delivery impossible. As your first week in ancient postal service ends, you understand that mail delivery before modern infrastructure was less a romantic adventure and more a death sentence carried out through exhaustion, violence, and systematic disregard for human life. The messages you're risking everything to deliver aren't personal correspondence or important news, but are primarily government bureaucracy and elite communication that benefits everyone except the couriers who make it possible. Tonight, you'll sleep in a courier barracks that smells like unwashed humanity, horse manure, and the kind of desperation that comes from knowing tomorrow brings another assignment that might be your last. Your dreams will be filled with images of dying horses, attacking bandits, and endless roads that stretch toward horizons you'll never reach. And you'll wake up with your body screaming in protest at the thought of climbing back on a horse. Welcome to the world of ancient postal service, where humanity's desire for long-distance communication required sacrificing thousands of workers who died in obscurity so that kings, generals, and merchants could exchange messages that were considered more valuable than the lives of the people who carried them. Your second week in ancient postal service begins with a financial revelation that transforms your understanding of why postal work was considered one of the worst occupations in the ancient world. You're not getting paid. In fact, you're expected to pay for the privilege of destroying your health and risking your life delivering government messages. Because the economic model of ancient postal service was designed around the assumption that couriers were essentially slaves whose labor and resources could be extracted without compensation. The morning briefing reveals the complete economic structure that makes postal service financially devastating for the workers who actually do the delivery. The supervisor explains with bureaucratic indifference that couriers are responsible for providing their own horses, equipment, food, lodging, and medical care, while receiving no payment beyond exemption from certain taxes that you can't afford to pay anyway because postal work prevents you from earning money through any productive employment. The horse ownership requirement creates an immediate economic crisis for most couriers because horses are expensive to purchase and impossible to maintain on non-existent wages. A decent horse costs more than most workers earn in several years. And postal service destroys horses so quickly that couriers must replace their mounts regularly or ride increasingly damaged animals that are progressively more likely to fail at critical moments. Your current horse, which you purchased using borrowed money at interest rates that would be considered criminal in modern contexts, is already showing signs of the exhaustion and damage that will make it useless for postal work within weeks. The horse's declining condition creates a financial countdown where you must either replace the animal before it collapses completely or continue riding it until catastrophic failure occurs at some unpredictable moment, probably while you're being chased by bandits or attempting a dangerous river crossing. The equipment costs extend beyond horses to include saddles, bridles, bags for carrying messages, weapons for self-defense that prove largely ineffective, and clothing suitable for travel in all weather conditions. Each item must be purchased and maintained by couriers who have no income, creating debt spirals that trap workers in permanent servitude because they can never earn enough to escape the occupation that's destroying them financially. The debt bondage system that controls postal couriers functions through loans that finance initial equipment purchases but can never be repaid because postal service generates no income while creating continuous expenses. The lenders are typically government officials or wealthy merchants who view courier debt as a control mechanism that ensures a supply of workers for an occupation that no one would voluntarily choose if they had alternatives. Your personal debt situation includes loans for your horse, equipment, and past living expenses, with interest accumulating faster than you could possibly repay even if postal work generated income, instead of just consuming resources. The debt effectively makes you a slave with extra steps, where you're legally free but economically trapped in an occupation that will probably kill you before you accumulate enough money to escape. Family obligation extends postal servitude across generations as sons inherit their father's debts and occupational assignments, creating multi-generational postal slavery where entire families are condemned to courier work because one ancestor made the mistake of accepting a postal assignment or borrowing money to purchase horses. The hereditary nature of postal service means that children are born into an occupation they didn't choose and cannot escape. The compensation structure for postal work consists primarily of exemptions from certain government obligations and occasional food rations that prevent immediate starvation but don't provide adequate nutrition for people performing extreme physical labor daily. The exemptions are theoretically valuable but practically worthless because you can't benefit from tax exemptions when you have no income to tax, and you can't take advantage of labor exemptions when you're already trapped in forced postal work. The horse economy that surrounds postal service reveals a system designed to extract maximum value from animals while minimizing costs to the government that operates the postal network. Couriers are expected to provide horses from personal resources, maintain the animals without adequate food or rest, and ride them until they die from exhaustion, at which point couriers must somehow obtain replacement horses despite having no money and being deeply in debt. The riding horses to death isn't metaphorical or occasional. It's the standard operational practice for postal service that prioritizes message speed over animal welfare. Horses are ridden at speeds that cause exhaustion, dehydration, and metabolic collapse, with animals frequently dying during deliveries or shortly afterward from the accumulated damage of repeated maximum effort exertion. The replacement costs for dead horses create financial catastrophes for couriers who must somehow obtain new mounts while already carrying debt from previous horses and having no income to finance purchases. The typical solution involves borrowing more money at predatory interest rates, deepening the debt bondage that makes escape from postal service impossible. The theft problems surrounding horses make courier finances even more precarious because horses represent the single most valuable asset that couriers possess, making them attractive targets for theft. Stolen horses must be replaced immediately because postal assignments cannot wait, forcing couriers to accept whatever loans are available, regardless of terms that would be considered extortionate in any reasonable economic system. Quality variations in horses mean that wealthy couriers on fresh, healthy animals can complete assignments that are impossible for poor couriers riding damaged, exhausted horses, creating performance differences that get attributed to courier skill or effort rather than to economic inequality that determines access to adequate equipment. The system blames workers for failures that result from inadequate resources while refusing to provide the resources necessary for success. Veterinary care for horses is essentially non-existent in ancient contexts, meaning that injured or sick animals either recover naturally or die, with no intermediate option for medical intervention that might save valuable animals. The absence of veterinary medicine means that horses decline progressively until they become completely useless, representing total financial loss for couriers who invested borrowed money in animals that provided limited service before dying. The breeding programs necessary for maintaining adequate horse supplies don't exist in organized form, creating chronic shortages of suitable postal horses, while horse prices remain high due to limited availability. The supply problems mean that couriers often cannot obtain horses at any price when replacements are needed urgently, forcing them to miss assignments and face penalties for failures caused by economic factors beyond their control. Infrastructure absence reveals how ancient postal service operated without the support systems that would be considered essential for any delivery network. There are no standardized relay stations, no guaranteed food supplies, no medical facilities, no weather shelters, and no communication systems that might help couriers coordinate activities or report problems. The relay stations that theoretically exist along postal routes are irregular, unreliable, and often non-functional, because maintaining stations requires resources that governments don't allocate and economic incentives that don't exist. Station keepers are supposed to provide fresh horses, food, and shelter, but they often abandon their posts because the compensation doesn't justify the isolation and danger of managing remote facilities. The food supply situation means that couriers are expected to carry sufficient provisions for entire journeys or purchase food along routes where settlements are sparse and merchants charge inflated prices to desperate travelers. The combination of inadequate carrying capacity and insufficient money means that couriers routinely experience malnutrition that contributes to health problems and makes physical labor progressively more difficult. The shelter absence means that couriers sleep outdoors, regardless of weather conditions, using whatever primitive camping equipment they can afford and carry. Sleeping outside exposes couriers to temperature extremes, precipitation, dangerous animals, and human predators who recognize that sleeping travelers are vulnerable targets for robbery and violence. Medical care for injured or sick couriers consists of whatever folk remedies they know, occasional charity from people they encounter, and hope that their bodies will heal naturally before injuries become fatal. The absence of medical infrastructure means that injuries that would be minor inconveniences with proper treatment often become permanent disabilities or causes of death. The support system absence creates complete isolation for couriers who travel alone without communication networks, emergency assistance, or coordination mechanisms that might provide help when problems occur. Couriers who experience accidents, illness, or equipment failures are entirely dependent on their own resources and whatever assistance they can obtain from strangers who have no obligation to help. The class exploitation underlying postal service reveals how ancient communication networks were designed to serve elite interests while externalizing all costs to workers who received no benefits from the systems they maintained. The messages that couriers risked their lives to deliver were primarily government bureaucracy, military communications, and merchant correspondence that benefited everyone except the couriers. Elite message priority meant that urgent communications for rulers, generals, and wealthy merchants took precedence over all other considerations, including courier health, safety, and survival. The assumption was that elite communication was infinitely valuable, while courier lives were essentially worthless, justifying any sacrifice of worker welfare for marginal improvements in message delivery speed. Common people exclusion from postal services meant that the vast majority of the population had no access to long-distance communication because postal networks served only those who could afford premium services or who wielded sufficient political power to command government resources. The postal service was a luxury good that required destroying worker lives to produce benefits that accrued exclusively to wealthy users. Courier disposability reflected social attitudes where postal workers were viewed as interchangeable resources whose deaths were unfortunate but acceptable costs of maintaining communication networks. The high mortality rates among couriers didn't trigger reforms because the people making postal policy weren't the people dying in postal service, creating incentive structures that guaranteed continued exploitation. As your second week ends, you understand that ancient postal service was economically structured to extract maximum labor and resources from workers while providing zero compensation. creating a system that trapped people in debt servitude and worked them to death for the benefit of elites who faced no consequences for courier casualties. The financial exploitation underlying mail delivery makes the physical dangers seem almost secondary to the systematic economic destruction of everyone who does the actual work. Tonight, you'll sleep knowing that every day of postal work increases your debt, damages your health, and reduces your life expectancy while generating benefits exclusively for people who consider your life less valuable than the messages you're carrying. Tomorrow will bring another assignment that costs you money to complete. Another step deeper into debt bondage that you'll never escape. And another day closer to the death or disability that's the most common endpoint for postal couriers. The economics of ancient postal service reveal that long-distance communication before modern infrastructure required systematically exploiting workers through debt, forced labor, and complete disregard for human welfare, making every delivered message a monument to economic injustice that most recipients never considered or acknowledged. Your third week in ancient postal service begins with an assignment that reveals the true scale of violence surrounding mail delivery. You're being sent through a mountain pass that's known locally as Courier's Graveyard, because the last 7 postal workers sent through this route disappeared completely, along with their horses, equipment, and messages. The supervisor hands you a sealed diplomatic pouch with complete indifference to your survival prospects. Reminds you that execution awaits if the message doesn't arrive, and wishes you good luck with the sincerity of someone who's already written you off as another casualty statistic. The bandit problem that plagues ancient postal routes isn't occasional robbery that couriers might avoid through caution and luck. It's systematic predation by organized criminal networks that view mail carriers as reliable sources of income because couriers travel alone, carry potentially valuable items, and can be attacked with minimal risk because there's no law enforcement presence on remote routes where most banditry occurs. The morning departure reveals the complete absence of security measures that might protect couriers from robbery. You're traveling alone because the Postal Service doesn't provide guards, riding a horse that's already exhausted from previous assignments, carrying weapons that consist of a short sword you barely know how to use, and following a route that everyone knows is controlled by bandits who've been operating with impunity for years. The mountain pass approach demonstrates why this particular route has such a deadly reputation. The terrain funnels all traffic through narrow passages where ambush is easy and escape is nearly impossible. The cliffs on either side provide perfect hiding places for attackers, while limiting your options to either proceeding forward into obvious danger or turning back and facing execution for failing to deliver your message. The first bandit attack occurs within an hour of entering the pass, when armed men emerge from concealment on both sides of the trail and surround you before you can react. There are at least 8 bandits, all armed with weapons that are significantly better than your inadequate sword. And they're operating with the confidence of people who've done this successfully many times before. The robbery process reveals the professional organization of bandit groups that specialize in attacking couriers. The bandits know exactly what they're looking for: messages that might contain valuable information, government documents that can be sold to foreign powers, commercial correspondence that reveals trade secrets, and whatever money or equipment the courier is carrying. They're not interested in random violence. They're interested in profit maximization through efficient robbery. Your diplomatic pouch is immediately confiscated, opened despite the official seals that are supposed to protect it, and examined by a bandit who can apparently read well enough to assess message value. The document you were carrying turns out to be sensitive diplomatic correspondence between rival kingdoms, making it extremely valuable to foreign intelligence networks that pay well for stolen government communications. The interrogation that follows demonstrates how bandits extract maximum value from captured couriers. They want to know who sent the message, who was supposed to receive it, what other messages you've carried recently, and what routes other couriers are using. The interrogation techniques include threats, physical violence, and promises of release that might or might not be genuine depending on how useful your information proves. The torture methods that bandits employ aren't sophisticated instruments of medieval dungeons, but are brutal practical techniques designed to cause pain without requiring special equipment. The pain is immediate and intense, and your resistance lasts approximately as long as it takes to realize that these people have no qualms about causing permanent injury or death to obtain information that they can sell. The information you provide under duress includes details about other courier routes, schedules for government message, deliveries, and identities of officials who send sensitive correspondence. This information will be used to plan future robberies, sold to foreign intelligence services, or leveraged for political purposes that you don't understand but will contribute to making postal service even more dangerous than it already is. The release decision that the bandits eventually make reflects calculations about whether you're more valuable alive as a potential information source or dead as a warning to other couriers. They decide to let you live, partly because killing you serves no purpose after they've extracted your information and stolen your cargo, and partly because spreading stories about brutal robberies discourages other couriers from attempting this route, making future ambushes easier. Your return journey without the message you were supposed to deliver creates a new crisis because you must report the robbery to authorities, who will assume you were either complicit in the theft or negligent in protecting the message. The assumption in ancient postal service is that lost messages result from courier failure rather than from systemic problems like inadequate security, insufficient resources, or impossible working conditions. The investigation that follows your robbery report consists primarily of officials accusing you of selling the message to bandits, cooperating with criminals, or simply being incompetent. The actual bandits who committed the robbery face no consequences because pursuing them would require military resources that governments don't allocate to protecting postal couriers who are considered expendable. The border-crossing nightmares that plague international postal routes reveal how political boundaries create additional dangers beyond simple banditry. Every border represents potential disaster because guards are often corrupt, hostile to foreigners, suspicious of anyone carrying documents, and empowered to detain, rob, or kill travelers with minimal accountability. Your next assignment involves carrying commercial correspondence between merchants in rival kingdoms that have recently been at war and maintain hostile relations despite current ceasefire. The border crossing requires navigating checkpoints where guards view all travelers as potential spies, and postal couriers carrying sealed documents are particularly suspicious because they might be engaging in espionage disguised as mail delivery. The customs brutality at border crossings reveals how guards use their authority to extract bribes, steal valuable goods, and harass travelers who have no recourse against official misconduct. The guards demand payment for allowing you to cross, search your belongings thoroughly while stealing anything portable and valuable, and delay your passage long enough that you fall behind schedule and face penalties for late delivery. The spy accusations that couriers routinely face at borders create life-threatening situations, because being identified as a spy typically results in imprisonment, torture, and execution. Couriers carrying government documents are automatically suspicious because they're transporting information between locations, which is exactly what spies do, making it nearly impossible to prove you're a legitimate postal worker rather than an intelligence operative. The detention you experience at one particularly hostile border post demonstrates how arbitrary authority operates in contexts without legal protections or due process. You're imprisoned for 3 days while guards investigate whether your documents are genuine, whether you're actually working for the sender you claim, and whether you have any valuable information that can be extracted through interrogation or sold to interested parties. The bribery requirements for border crossing mean that successful mail delivery requires paying unofficial fees at every checkpoint, with payment amounts varying based on guard greed, political tensions, and courier vulnerability. The bribes must be paid from your own resources because the Postal Service doesn't provide funding for border fees, creating additional financial burdens for workers who already receive no compensation for their labor. The arbitrary detention that occurs at borders reflects how guards exercise power without constraints. You can be imprisoned for days or weeks while officials decide whether to allow passage, confiscate messages, demand additional bribes, or simply abuse their authority because they can. The detention delays deliveries, creates penalties for late arrival, and demonstrates how political borders make postal service even more unreliable than geography and banditry already make it. Document forgery problems arise because the papers that are supposed to authenticate your identity and legitimize your postal mission are easily forged, difficult to verify, and often ignored by border guards who assume all documents are fake until proven otherwise through payment of sufficient bribes. The forged papers that some couriers carry become indistinguishable from legitimate documents, creating situations where honest couriers are treated as criminals, while criminals with good forgeries pass through easily. The political complications surrounding mail delivery intensify when shifting alliances between kingdoms mean that routes that were safe last month become deadly this month because nations that were at peace are now at war. Or vice versa. The geopolitical changes occur faster than postal routes can adapt, creating situations where couriers unknowingly cross into hostile territory and face capture, imprisonment, or execution for violating borders that recently didn't exist or weren't enforced. Weather as a weapon reveals how natural conditions combine with human dangers to make postal work even more deadly. The storms, floods, and extreme temperatures that you're expected to ignore create vulnerabilities that bandits exploit by attacking when weather conditions make escape impossible and resistance ineffective. The desert crossing deaths that occur regularly on postal routes through arid regions result from heat, thirst, and exhaustion that kill both horses and riders who attempt to maintain delivery schedules despite environmental conditions that would stop any reasonable person from traveling. The bodies of dead couriers and horses mark routes through deserts, serving as warnings that are ignored because Postal Service cannot acknowledge weather as a valid excuse for delayed delivery. The mountain disasters that plague high-altitude routes include avalanches that bury couriers, altitude sickness that incapacitates riders, and falls from narrow trails that send horses and riders plunging to deaths that might not be discovered for weeks or months. The mountain routes are used because they're the shortest paths between destinations, not because they're safe, and courier casualties are considered acceptable costs of maintaining efficient communication. Winter mortality reaches epidemic levels when postal routes continue operating during seasons when travel should be impossible. The freezing temperatures, blizzards, and ice conditions kill couriers with such regularity that winter assignments are essentially death sentences that workers cannot refuse because refusal means execution for disobedience. The disease transmission role that postal couriers play in spreading epidemics represents another hidden cost of mail delivery that no one considers when dispatching couriers through plague-infected regions. Couriers are disease vectors who carry infections between communities while moving at speeds that allow diseases to spread faster than they would through normal population movement. As your third week ends, you understand that ancient postal service existed in contexts of constant violence, where bandits, border guards, hostile governments, and natural disasters combined to make every delivery attempt potentially fatal. The romance of mail carrying evaporates completely when you're recovering from torture, dealing with robbery trauma, and preparing for your next assignment that will expose you to similar dangers with no additional protection or compensation. Tonight, you'll sleep with injuries from your recent bandit attack, anxiety about upcoming border crossings, and knowledge that tomorrow brings another journey through territories where violence is the norm rather than the exception. Your dreams will feature ambushes, interrogations, and the faces of bandits who might have killed you but decided your information was more valuable than your life. The violence surrounding ancient postal service reveals that long-distance communication required sacrificing not just courier health and finances, but also their safety. As workers were expected to traverse lawless territories with no protection, while carrying valuable items that made them attractive targets for every criminal and corrupt official along their routes. The censorship violence that accompanies surveillance reveals how authorities don't just monitor correspondence, but actively suppress messages they consider threatening. Message destruction occurs regularly, as officials burn letters, destroy documents, and eliminate correspondence that contains ideas, information, or expressions that authorities want to suppress. The burning process you witness involves officials systematically destroying messages that were deemed too dangerous to allow circulation. The destruction occurs without notifying senders or recipients, creating situations where people believe messages were delivered when actually they were intercepted and destroyed by authorities who decided the contents couldn't be allowed to reach their destinations. Sender punishment extends beyond message destruction to include arresting, torturing, and executing people whose correspondence revealed dangerous thoughts or activities. The punishment serves multiple purposes, eliminating specific threats, deterring others from similar communication, and demonstrating state power to monitor and control all information flow within the empire. Courier complicity in censorship makes you an active participant in suppressing communication that authorities consider problematic. You're not just delivering government-approved messages, you're also helping to enforce censorship by failing to deliver suppressed correspondence, reporting suspicious activities, and participating in a system that treats private communication as state property subject to official control. The moral compromises required for postal work include betraying people who trust you to deliver their messages, participating in surveillance that leads to persecution and death, and maintaining the fiction that postal service provides reliable communication when actually it provides reliable surveillance. The compromises are not optional. They're job requirements that you must fulfill to avoid being classified as a security threat yourself. Self-censorship develops among people who understand that postal surveillance makes honest communication dangerous. Message senders learn to avoid topics that might trigger official interest, use coded language that obscures meaning, and simply not discuss important matters through postal services that cannot be trusted to maintain privacy. The chilling effect of comprehensive surveillance extends beyond preventing specific dangerous communications to suppressing all genuine expression because people cannot predict what will be considered threatening. The uncertainty makes any honest communication risky, leading people to avoid using postal services for anything beyond trivial matters that wouldn't interest surveillance officials. Code development represents attempts to evade surveillance through encrypted communication that obscures message meaning from officials who read correspondence. The codes range from simple substitution ciphers to complex systems involving prearranged meanings for innocent-seeming phrases. The effectiveness varies, and using codes itself triggers suspicion because officials assume that encrypted messages must contain dangerous information worth hiding. The decryption efforts by government officials include torture of message senders and recipients to force revelation of code meanings, employment of specialists who attempt to break encryption systems, and surveillance of multiple messages to identify patterns that might reveal code structure. The official response to coded communication is typically more severe than the response to plain text messages because encryption itself is treated as evidence of criminal or treasonous intent. Reliability impossibility in surveilled postal systems results from the combination of censorship, delays from security reviews, message destruction, and official interference that makes successful delivery unpredictable. Senders cannot know whether their messages will arrive. Recipients cannot know whether they've received all correspondence sent to them. And both parties understand that anything sent through postal services will be read by officials whose purposes conflict with communication privacy Lost mail epidemic isn't primarily caused by courier incompetence or transportation difficulties, but by deliberate destruction of messages that officials decide shouldn't circulate. The official explanations for lost mail blame bandits, weather, or courier failures, rather than acknowledging government censorship that accounts for many disappeared messages. Courier disappearance represents another form of mail suppression, where postal workers are eliminated along with messages they carry when officials decide that both the correspondence and the courier represent security threats. The disappearances are never explained officially, creating uncertainty about whether couriers died from occupational hazards or were deliberately eliminated by authorities who wanted to suppress specific communications. Corruption within postal surveillance systems allows officials to sell information from intercepted messages, blackmail people based on correspondence contents, and manipulate mail delivery for personal benefit. The same surveillance apparatus that's supposed to serve state security also serves official enrichment through exploitation of private information that passing through their hands. Elite monopoly on trusted communication means that wealthy and powerful individuals can sometimes arrange for messages to bypass normal postal surveillance through private courier networks, personal servants, or diplomatic channels that provide better privacy than state postal services. The ability to communicate privately becomes a privilege of elites who can afford alternatives to surveilled postal systems, while common people have no options beyond state services that monitor everything. As your fourth week ends, you understand that ancient postal service wasn't just dangerous and exploitative, but was also a comprehensive surveillance system that treated all communication as state property, subject to official monitoring, censorship, and control. Your role as a courier makes you complicit in surveillance that destroys privacy, enables political persecution, and suppresses information that authorities want to control. Tonight, you'll sleep knowing that every message you deliver has been read by officials who use the information for purposes that often harm the very people who trusted the postal system to protect their correspondence. Tomorrow will bring more deliveries that serve state surveillance more than they serve communication needs, and more participation in a system that makes genuine private correspondence impossible. The surveillance dimension of ancient postal service reveals that long-distance communication before modern privacy protections meant surrendering all confidentiality to governments that treated mail monitoring as a fundamental state function rather than a violation of human rights that didn't yet exist as a concept anyone recognized. Your fifth and final week doesn't begin in ancient Persia, but back in the present day, where you've returned from your journey through postal history with a completely transformed understanding of what it means to complain about package delivery times. You're standing in front of your mailbox, holding a letter that was delivered reliably, affordably, and safely by a postal worker who wasn't tortured, executed, or financially ruined in the process of bringing it to your door. And for the first time in your life, you understand that modern postal service represents one of humanity's most underappreciated miracles. The technological evolution that transformed postal service from a death sentence into a functional public service began with developments so gradual that no single innovation can claim credit for the transformation. The relay station concept that existed in primitive form in ancient systems was slowly improved through centuries of incremental infrastructure development that eventually created networks of facilities where couriers could actually rest, eat, and exchange horses without facing immediate death from exhaustion. The relay station development that made continuous long-distance mail delivery sustainable required massive investments in infrastructure that governments only made after recognizing that reliable communication provided economic and military advantages worth the construction costs. The stations evolved from occasional shelters to comprehensive facilities with stables, sleeping quarters, food supplies, and personnel dedicated to maintaining the network rather than just exploiting the couriers. The standardization of relay station spacing, services, and operational procedures created predictability that ancient postal systems completely lacked. Couriers could plan journeys knowing approximately where they could rest, when they could exchange horses, and what resources would be available along routes that became increasingly reliable as infrastructure improved. The Pony Express mythology represents an interesting case study in how Americans romanticize postal history while ignoring the brutal realities. The Pony Express operated for only 18 months before financial failure forced it to close. During that time, it employed extremely young riders who worked in conditions that would be considered criminal child labor today. The riders faced constant danger from weather and violence, and the entire operation lost enormous amounts of money while demonstrating that fast mail delivery using relay riders was commercially unviable. The Pony Express reality included riders as young as 14, working 100-mile shifts at speeds that destroyed horses and caused injuries that disabled many riders permanently. The romantic image of brave horsemen galloping across scenic prairies obscures the fact that this was dangerous, exploitative work that killed riders regularly and never made economic sense as a business model. The advertising genius that created Pony Express mythology transformed a commercial failure into a symbol of American frontier spirit, which is approximately as honest as describing ancient Persian postal couriers as happy adventurers rather than enslaved workers riding horses to death under threat of execution. The mythology persists because people prefer romantic narratives to complicated realities about how communication infrastructure actually developed. Railroad transformation of postal service represents the first genuinely revolutionary improvement in mail delivery speed and reliability. Trains could carry mail faster and more reliably than horses while requiring less direct human suffering. Though railroad mail service created its own occupational hazards, including train accidents, robbery, and the dangerous work of sorting mail in moving railway cars. The railway mail service that operated on American trains employed workers who sorted correspondence while trains traveled at high speeds, creating working conditions that combined clerical tasks with constant motion, noise, and danger from derailments or collisions. The railway mail clerks developed impressive skills in memorizing postal routes and sorting mail rapidly while dealing with a moving workspace. But they also faced risks that killed or injured many workers during the decades when rail dominated long-distance mail transport. Telegraph disruption of traditional postal service demonstrated how communication technology could bypass physical message delivery entirely by transmitting information electronically. The telegraph didn't eliminate postal service, but it did eliminate the need for urgent messages to travel by courier, allowing postal systems to focus on less time-sensitive correspondence and physical packages that couldn't be telegraphed. The impact of telegraph on postal courier employment was significant as demand for extremely fast message delivery declined when telegraphs could transmit information instantly over wires. The couriers who had risked their lives for speed suddenly found their most dangerous work was obsolete, replaced by technology that provided better service without requiring anyone to ride horses to death. The penny black revolution in postal history occurred when Britain introduced the first adhesive postage stamp and created affordable postal rates that made mail service accessible to ordinary people rather than just elites and governments. The innovation of prepaid postage at affordable prices transformed postal service from luxury good to public utility, democratizing long-distance communication in ways that changed society fundamentally. The American postal development that followed included rural free delivery, which brought mail service to isolated farms and small communities that previously had no reliable postal access. The RFD service required hiring thousands of postal carriers who traveled rural routes in all weather conditions. But the working conditions, though challenging, were vastly better than ancient courier work because carriers received actual wages, faced no execution threats, and operated within systems that provided some basic support and safety. The mail order catalog transformation of American commerce demonstrates how reliable postal service enabled entirely new business models. companies like Sears and Montgomery Ward could ship products to customers anywhere in the country with reasonable confidence that packages would arrive as ordered, creating shopping opportunities for rural Americans who previously had limited access to goods beyond what local merchants stocked. The democratizing impact of affordable postal service extended beyond commerce to enable social connections, romantic relationships, business coordination, and information exchange that would have been impossible when postal service was available only to wealthy elites. The transformation from exclusive luxury to universal public service represents one of the most significant expansions of human capability in history. Airmail pioneers who developed aviation-based postal service died with depressing regularity as experimental mail flights crashed due to mechanical failures, weather problems, pilot error, and the general unreliability of early aircraft. The romance of airmail obscures the reality that early aviation postal service killed many pilots while providing mail delivery that was often no faster than trains and considerably more expensive. The technological improvements that eventually made airmail practical and safe required decades of development in aircraft design, navigation systems, weather forecasting, and operational procedures. The modern airmail system that delivers packages across continents in days or hours represents the endpoint of evolution that began with people dying in primitive aircraft, attempting to prove that aviation could serve postal functions. Modern postal miracles become apparent when you compare contemporary service to historical realities. The universal service obligation that requires postal services to deliver to every address means that someone living on a remote rural route receives mail delivery at the same price as someone in a major city, representing a massive subsidy for rural service that makes communication access independent of geographic isolation. The affordable pricing of modern postage means that sending a letter across the country costs less than a cup of coffee. While in ancient systems, sending messages required wealth that most people didn't possess. The democratization of postal access represents a transformation in human communication capacity that's so complete that most people don't recognize it as the revolutionary change it actually is. Reliability rates approaching 99% for successful delivery mean that modern postal service provides consistency that would have seemed miraculous to ancient couriers who considered successful delivery of even half messages to be acceptable performance. The modern expectation that mail will arrive as addressed represents standards that are orders of magnitude better than historical norms. The speed of modern mail delivery, measured in days rather than weeks or months, reflects transportation improvements that make contemporary service seem impossibly fast compared to historical standards. A letter sent across the country arrives faster than ancient messages traveled a few hundred miles, demonstrating how transportation technology has compressed effective distances. Safety improvements mean that modern postal workers face occupational hazards that are trivial compared to historical courier work. Contemporary mail carriers aren't regularly murdered by bandits, executed by governments, or worked to death through impossible delivery schedules. The job is still physically demanding and has its challenges. But it's not a death sentence the way ancient postal work was. The Amazon delivery driver complaints about working conditions represent genuine labor issues that deserve attention and reform. But they also reflect how modern expectations have shifted to where people consider inadequate break times and productivity monitoring to be serious problems. Which they are. While historical couriers faced execution, torture, and systematic exploitation that make contemporary delivery work seem relatively benign by comparison. The modern postal worker perspective shows that delivery jobs remain challenging with long hours, physical demands, weather exposure, and pressure to maintain productivity. The acknowledgement that modern conditions are difficult doesn't diminish by comparison to historical horrors, but rather emphasizes that delivery work has always been hard and that contemporary workers deserve respect and fair treatment for their labor. The historical context doesn't excuse modern delivery worker exploitation, but does provide perspective about how far postal service has evolved from systems that treated couriers as disposable slaves to systems that recognize delivery workers as employees deserving of wages, benefits, and basic safety protections. As your final week ends, you understand that modern postal service represents a triumph of infrastructure development, technological innovation, and social progress that transformed mail delivery from elite luxury requiring human sacrifice to universal public service that most people take completely for granted. The convenience of reliable, affordable, safe mail delivery required centuries of gradual improvement that eliminated most but not all of the exploitation that characterized ancient postal systems. Tonight, you'll sleep in a world where complaining about package delivery delays feels petty after witnessing what postal service used to require. The 2-day shipping that people consider slow would have been impossible magic to ancient couriers who spent weeks delivering messages across distances that modern planes cross in hours. The postal service that delivers to every address represents infrastructure, investments, and social commitments that previous generations couldn't imagine. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to appreciate postal workers who deliver your mail without dying in the process, without being executed for delays, and without sacrificing their financial security to provide service that you pay pennies to receive. The lesson from postal history is that reliable communication infrastructure represents accumulated centuries of human effort to eliminate the suffering that ancient systems required. Sweet dreams of carrier pigeons, pneumatic tubes, and email systems that communicate instantly without requiring anyone to ride horses to death or survive bandit attacks. The Postal Service evolved from a death sentence into a public utility through gradual improvements that most people never think about, but which represent one of humanity's greatest and most underappreciated achievements. The journey from ancient postal chaos to modern delivery systems reveals that long-distance communication required transforming systems that treated couriers as expendable slaves into systems that recognized delivery workers as valuable employees. The transformation isn't complete, and modern postal workers still deserve better treatment. But the progress from ancient exploitation to contemporary service represents genuine improvement that's worth recognizing while continuing to work toward further reforms. The postal service you take for granted when checking your mailbox represents the efforts of millions of workers who spent centuries gradually building infrastructure, improving technology, and advocating for better conditions that transformed mail delivery from one of the worst occupations in human history into work that's challenging but no longer routinely fatal.